Hi, my name is Johann De Lange, and I'm here today to present this webinar on mergers and acquisitions. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm a chartered accountant. I've been very active in presenting seminars and workshops in the last few years. However, that is not my daytime job. What I do for a living is I'm a mergers and acquisitions deal maker, and I have been involved in corporate finance since after I qualified as a chartered accountant in 1998. Today's webinar about mergers and acquisitions, I'm going to look specifically at synergy benefits as a driver behind value for mergers and acquisitions. Obviously, the time is quite limited for this, and I assume a certain understanding from people looking at this webinar. So I'm going to focus on more on the strategic angle around mergers and acquisitions. It's impossible to teach someone mergers and acquisitions in an hour and a half or the time that we have available. So I'm focusing on the strategy behind it. And central to that strategy are synergy benefits as a driver for mergers and acquisitions value creation. So what are synergy benefits? It can be seen as sometimes commonly referred to as 1 + 1 = 3, or the way that I also like to look at it, it's that small component, or it's a component that unlocks the value for a whole other lot of components, especially in corporate mergers and acquisitions, where more value is unlocked and other possibilities are unlocked through the addition of that special ingredient into the mix. I want to start by referring back to value, because that is critical to understand the role of synergy benefits. You have to be able to measure it and to understand value, and value created through a merger. PricewaterhouseCoopers conducted a survey in 2008, and their findings were quite interesting. They found that 64% of recent deals completed were regarded as strategic success. Only 44% said it was a financial success, and even less than that, 38% said it was an operational success. So that's quite interesting. I would assume that the 64%, or roughly 2/3, would relate to unlocking some value in the group context. So in other words, not the target company itself that was taken over. And 44% would probably refer to the company that was taken over, and whether there was the value exceeded the value paid for the company, the value realized by the acquirers. And then just 38% operational success, which highlights how difficult it is to properly integrate and into the existing group, and to get the synergies going on an operational level. But I think we need to take a step back, and before we start talking about synergy benefits, and just look at the concept of value. And I will look at the discounted cash flow method as the primary valuation method, but I'll also look at some other secondary valuation methods. Basically, what a value comes down to, it's the net present value of future returns. Whether it's a discounted cash flow method, whether it is in effect an earnings multiple type of valuation method that look at the number of times that the value represents profits. It can refer to payback period, but it refers to returns. And even the net asset value, which refers to a value that if you had to liquidate that company, and what is the cash that will accrue to the owners of that company. But back to the discounted cash flow method, in essence, a net present value of future cash flows. Typically, there would be a forecast. The forecast period is determined in the confidence that the valuer has in forecasting those particular cash flows. Forecasts are by their very nature an estimate. They're not always accurate, but it's based on certain assumptions to the best of our knowledge, or of conditions that exist at the valuation date. Obviously, you're not necessarily, unless the business has a limited lifespan of only 3 years. It will still be there in 3 years, and it will have value. And that value is also the net present value of all the future returns going into the future. And that is what we commonly refer to as a terminal value. Now, a lot of people have mentioned to me, but surely there has to be a cut-off point. It can't just be going on forever. There is, in essence, a cut-off point. If you take, for example, a terminal value is represented by the last year's cash flows after the forecast. So in this case, it would be year 4. And that is divided by the difference between the growth rate and the expected return, or the weighted average cost of capital. So let's just assume that if we're looking at a value of 1 and and a weighted average cost of capital of 20% and maybe a growth rate thereafter of 6%, that is in essence 14%. So if you divide 1 by 14%, gives you more or less 7. And 7 is the number of years, or that's typically the multiple that would apply in such an instant. So there is inherently a cutoff that's built into the formula. So the net present value of the cash flows that is calculated represents what we call enterprise value. Now, the enterprise value is if you had to isolate a business and you exclude all cash that is not needed, you exclude your liabilities, you exclude your assets that you don't need to operate that business. So in other words, only the assets and liabilities that you need to operate that business, and you can sell that out as a standalone set of assets and liabilities. That is what represents enterprise value. So that would be typically your fixed assets, your fixed operating assets. It would be your working capital that you need, as well as the goodwill that you have in the business. Goodwill, of course, represents the difference between your enterprise value and your operating assets and liabilities and working capital. Of course, a lot of businesses don't exist only of the enterprise itself. There may be a cash build-up, there may be excessive working capital, especially if a very conservative dividend policy was followed in the past. So there will be a build-up of some liquid assets. There may be a build-up in smaller companies of lifestyle assets, for example, and which could include cash. And also, a business doesn't necessarily need liabilities to exist. There can be ongoing liabilities that is included in the working capital, but there can also be external liabilities that once settled, the business carries on as normal. And that would be deducted from the non-core assets, the excess cash, and the liabilities, non-core liabilities will be deducted from the enterprise value. And that would give you the entity value, or you could look at it also as the value of the shares. So if you buy the company itself, you buy all the shares, that would be the value of the shares, and that will include your enterprise, as well as your non-core assets, your excess cash, and your liabilities. And therefore, you have to take it into account. If, however, you only buy the enterprise out of a company, the enterprise value will apply in such an instance. And that is the basic premises of a discounted cash flow method, and how a value is determined in terms of future cash flows and the value and the returns that represents. So how do you value synergy benefits? Well, in essence, you need to look at the cash flows. If you look at the target company, you need to look at the cash flows as at the transaction date. What is the company that you are buying? And then have a very good understanding of what those cash flows will look like after the acquisition. So in other words, if there's an expectation of additional cash flows generated and profits generated because of that specific strategic ingredient that is acquired, that would give rise to a larger value. Obviously, companies exist to make profits. So if the profits increase and the cash flows also increase, it means that the value will also increase. And that increase in the value is what is referred to as the value of the synergies. Now, it can also be that you don't only look at the target company and how the cash flows are enhanced, but you can also do an incremental value calculation where in other areas of the group or the acquirer also increase value. And we'll look at how value can be unlocked also for the acquirer themselves. So not necessarily just an increase in profits in the target, but also increased profits by the acquirer itself. And those incremental cash flows can also, on a discounted cash flow method, can also be calculated, and that increment in the group will be added to the synergy benefits to calculate the synergy benefits. So what are the other valuation methods that we can also look at? Well, always as a benchmark, you need to look at the net asset value. It underpins the value. Normally, if you do a valuation, you look at the greater of net asset value or the discounted cash flow method. Discounted cash flow method is a proxy for future returns, but it may be a type of a business that is not profitable. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. In terms of the discounted cash flow method, it won't have any value because there won't be necessarily be future operating assets or operating cash flows that are expected. But in terms of the net asset value, it will have value because some of the assets will be sold out. In fact, if you compare the discounted cash flow method with the net asset value, they should equate to the same if the business is not operated on a profitable basis anymore and there is a plan to liquidate the assets. Why would that be? Because you would look at the cash flows that the liquidation of those assets and settling the liabilities, what the net cash flows of that would be. So it's pretty much comes down to the same thing. Very important when you look at a net asset value, the quick method or the temptation is also just to look at the balance sheet, look at the reserves, and that is the value that is accepted as the net asset value of a business. But there can be hidden assets and hidden liabilities. For example, your property, plant and equipment you may be able to realize a much higher value in the marketplace than the net book value or the accounting value at which it's stated in the balance sheet. So you need to look at market value. The opposite can also be true, that in a fire sale basis, you may not be able to sell the assets at the accounting values at which they stated in the balance sheet, and then the value will be less. Contingent liabilities are typically those liabilities that are not stated on the face of the balance sheet, but it may be a claim that can be instituted about the business against the business, and there needs to be some kind of a provision for that also, if it is realizable and if it can be accurately measured in some kind of a way. If you are a buyer of a business and you're looking at some contingent liabilities that can maybe realized, then it needs to be taken into account. A different way of doing it is to accept a higher value as a buyer when you look at a net asset value basis, but then you structure in a guarantee or warranties against contingent liabilities. And when we discuss some risk mitigation mechanisms, we can have a closer look at that. Another method is also what is commonly used in the market is a price to earnings ratio. What it comes down to is entity value divided by the net profit after tax. It's quite easy to do that calculation when you look at a whole lot of listed entities, because you know what the earnings per share is, and you also know what the share price is. So you divide the share price by the earnings per share and you get to a price to earnings ratio. And typically that will be published, let's say, in a newspaper where you can do a comparison of the different stocks. However, remember that it is used as a benchmark, but when it is used as a valuation method, it definitely has a lot of limitations. Firstly, balance sheets differ. So when you look at net profit after tax, some companies may have more debt on the balance sheet than other companies. and therefore they will have a higher interest charge than other companies. And that can skew the price to earnings ratio quite substantially. Also, the ratio itself, a common method is just to look at the stock exchange and maybe to look at some kind of an industry average. But within a specific sector, it can vary from negatives to positives. So the average doesn't give you a proper point of departure. Also, listed companies are different to private companies. You have different liquidity. You typically have different. It's different size to to smaller companies. So the ratio itself is probably not a proper point of departure. It is too simplistic. And the other thing also to consider is the extent to which normalization needs to take place. If you would have to go for some kind of an earnings multiple, I would rather value the enterprise value first. And instead of a discounted cash flow method, you could use the EBIT or the enterprise value over EBIT or EBITDA. So, for example, if you know that an industry standard is for acquisitions to take place at an EBIT or an EBITDA multiple of 5, that would mean if your EBIT or your EBITDA multiple, for example, is 10 million, that would give you an enterprise value of 5 million. And then you can go back to your original calculation where you work with your enterprise value and you deduct you add your non-core assets plus your excess cash less liabilities, and that will give you a value of shares. Just had to skip a few there. All right. So those are the different valuation methods. Normally, it's technically probably more correct to use a discounted cash flow method as your primary valuation method, and then you use your other valuation method as reasonableness tests, and you try to understand in the context of a discounted cash flow method where would the underlying assumptions typically differ from a benchmark companies or peers in the market. Why would your multiples be higher or lower? So you don't use the multiples typically to value the company, you use the DCF, but you use the ratios, the price to earnings ratio or the enterprise value over EBITDA or EBIT ratio to compare it to other comparable companies or peers in the market. So how does that your valuation relate to the deal? Remember, in the end, the value is a function of negotiation. It's willing buyer, willing seller. We operate in a free market system. So it is the price that is ultimately negotiated between a willing and an informed buyer and a willing and an informed seller. You would have to assume that they would do the calculations themselves. Sometimes it will be based on a little bit of emotion. Sometimes there will be very clear mandates from investment committees and the board of directors in which ranges companies can be acquired. But it's normally a function of negotiation. So how do you negotiate? How do you understand what the intrinsic value would be and how that would have to differ from the transaction price at the end? Well, let's just go back to the concept of synergy benefits. If you look at your intrinsic value, which you determine through a more formal valuation, and you look at your value of your synergy benefits, which is represented by the green bar there, you get to a total value where what you think this combined business will be worth. Obviously, you won't buy at the combined value because you want to create value out of it. If you buy at the combined value, it means that you get no value out of it and the seller will get all the value. Similarly, if the seller has an understanding of what synergy benefits will be generated, they will understand typically how much is at stake and what is the value that the buyer can harvest from this particular transaction. So they know that they would negotiate for a transaction premium. So what is the negotiation range? Is it between synergy benefits and or the total value, including synergy benefits, and the intrinsic value, which is based on a formal valuation? No, it won't be. It will be at X. What does X represent? X is the maximum percentage of the synergy benefits that the buyer will be willing to give away. In that particular graph, it looks quite high. In practice, it is a little bit lower than that. So that is the maximum that will be payable. So what is the minimum that the seller will sell for? The seller won't sell for less than intrinsic value, because then it's better to hold on to the investments. Because remember, it is the company that's being sold, or the value, is just the net present value of future returns. So if you sell it for less than your intrinsic value, it means that it would be better for you just to keep it and just to earn those returns into the future. So that sets the minimum and the maximum. So RV, or intrinsic value in this case, would be the floor of the negotiation range, and X would be the maximum in the negotiation range. So somewhere in between there would be a transaction price that would be negotiated, and on the bars on the right hand side, that is represented by TB, or the black bar, which is the difference between the minimum or the intrinsic value and the eventual transaction price, can be seen as the transaction premium, and that is the value that accrues to the seller. So what are some of the merger risks and costs that we need to consider? Well, for starters, you need to look at transaction costs. An acquisition is quite an expensive exercise. There are many costs to consider. You would have to pay a transaction advisor if it's not done internally. There are often there's a cost of funding if it's partly funded by debt, or if there needs to be some rights issue or capital raised to finance the transaction, if it's not financed out of your pocket, and that will come with a raising fee. Typically your advisors, which would be your corporate lawyers, it would be your due diligence consultants, your corporate advisors have transaction costs, and if the transaction qualifies as that it's reportable, or the competition commission needs to approve it, there are also quite hefty costs involved in there. So there are a lot of transaction costs. Then another risk is, of course, underperformance. If the value that is paid is based on a certain expectation of profits, and there's an underperformance of that profit, then it means that value is destroyed. It means that that business is actually worth less than what was originally anticipated, and there's a reduction in the value that was acquired versus the price that was paid. Negative synergies, maybe that sounds a little bit strange, but it could be those unintended costs or loss of revenue as a result of two companies coming together. Just to give you two examples, if a company is acquired and the workforce salary scales are substantially lower than the group company or the acquirer, and there needs to be an adjustment to the salary scales, that would be a negative synergy, because it would obviously impact the profits of the target company. It could also be that the target company is a supplier to one of the competitors of the acquirer, and after the acquisition, some of the contracts or some of the orders may fall away, which would obviously also impact the profitability, cash flows, and ultimately the value that is lost. If you pay and certain synergies are not realizing, so if it's not well defined, if it's more wish list than practical synergies that are engineered and it doesn't realize, and there was a payment in a transaction premium for those synergies, that's also value destroyed. Opportunity cost, very important. If a company has the capacity on the balance sheet and the cash available to do acquisitions, and they do the wrong acquisition, then there's an opportunity cost. They could have invested those funds or geared their balance sheets on a on a much more productive asset, a much more profitable asset. It could be an asset that could have been acquired, or it could have been an investment to develop a certain market, for example. But there's an opportunity cost also there that needs to be taken into account. And then, of course, contingent liabilities that can't be recovered through the normal warranty clauses. So in other words, if there are claims afterwards and the acquirer wasn't aware of those claims, that could rise to liabilities that were not taken into account in the initial valuation. So how do you mitigate some of these risks? Well, there are quite a few methods, but I'm going to look at the main ones. Firstly, you need to understand the business, the inner workings of the business that is being acquired. And that is normally done through the performance of a due diligence. Now, due diligence can be in many formats. A financial due diligence is normally the main due diligence, but also that can be, what can also be included would be a legal due diligence. You can look at a market due diligence, which would be market research. You could look at an intellectual property due diligence. It just depends on what the critical information is that you need in order to make an informed decision on this company. So in other words, you don't just take a business plan or what you know of this company or what has been presented and you regard it as true on face value. There's a bit of more of a verification, a bit more analysis on the business that is needed before you can make an informed decision. It gives more background information. It's very important when it comes to negotiating the contracts, because normally if there are any adverse findings that could give rise to a possible dilution in value, it can be addressed through different mechanisms in the business. So the contract can be adjusted, and there can be different points of negotiation in the contract to mitigate those possible adverse effects. Very popular when larger companies are buying smaller companies, especially if it's private companies. Also, especially if it is, if it's a company that's been owner managed, so the owner sells. You don't exactly know what is in the company, and there can be more contingent liabilities that meet the eye. For example, a taxation contingent liability of undeclared taxes, or so in such a case, it makes more sense for a company to buy the business out of the company itself. If it buys it into a clean company, a lot of the old risks or contingent liabilities remain behind. Take the example of historical tax evasion. As soon as the company's shares are acquired and there's a new board of directors, the acquirer's directors that they assign to the board have a fiduciary duty to inform revenue services and to report any tax evasion. And obviously that will knock the value of the business. So it becomes their problem also. Whereas where the business is acquired, it will be in a clean entity, or at least an entity where the acquirer knows what the risks are, and those risks can be managed. And the risk, many of the risks will, for contingent liabilities, will stay behind in the old company of the target business. Typically, some kind of a level of performance will be structured into a transaction. It could be profit warranties, it could be cash flow warranties, revenue warranties, etc. But profit warranties are the most popular, and that earns or that serves as a basis for applying different types of formulas. What it comes down to is that if the profit is less than what is forecasted, there needs to be some kind of a compensation for the acquirer, because it means that the value was originally overstated. Now that can be done in a few ways, which I'll quickly discuss. An earn out, a claw back, and a claw in. An earn out is typically where there's a profit warranty and the full purchase price isn't paid immediately. It could be that let's say 50% of it is paid up front, and then after a year After an audit, the profits are calculated again. There could be a or an agreed multiple on the EBIT or the EBITDA, and the audited EBIT or the EBITDA, and that which can be applied. So let's say, for example, there's a forecast profit of 100 million. The transaction EBIT multiple is 6, which gives you a value of 600 million, and 50% of that can be paid out up front, if that is the agreement, which means 300 million. But let's assume that the profits in the first year are actually, after a year, it's audited and the EBIT is 80 million. So if that multiple is applied, the 6 multiple is applied to the 80 million, that's a value of 480 million. So the second payment would be 480 million less the 300 million, which is 180 million, which is less than the expected original 300 million, meaning 50% upfront and 50% after the year. It could actually also be, there's still a level of risk here for the buyer. Let's say, for example, the 300 million was paid upfront, but the profits are actually 40 million. So that 40 million times 6 would give 240 million. So if the 300 million was paid upfront, that 60 million will be a loss for the acquirer. It's still better than a 360 million loss, but nevertheless it doesn't cover all the losses or totally eliminates the risk. A different method can be a clawback method, and that would be where the full purchase price is paid upfront, but a calculation based on a multiple once again is made based on after a year or two, whatever the warranty period is, at a particular profitability. So using our example of the 100 million EBIT, again, times the 6 multiple, that would be a full payment of 600 million upfront. If, for example, the profits are 80 million times the 6, which is 480 million, there's a shortfall that is calculated after year 1 of 120 million. That has to be repaid. But obviously, as you can probably spot here, credit risk is something that has to be taken into account here. So will the seller have the ability to pay back that amount? Now, typically, if the transaction is done between two reputable corporate organizations or companies, sufficient size and resources, then it could be. There could be a corporate guarantee that backs it for such a type of transaction. But if it is a smaller company and it's an owner-managed company, for example, that wishes to retire and emigrate afterwards, obviously there's going to be a credit risk. There's going to be a risk of not recovering what has been paid out. And in such a case, the clawback method would not provide adequate protection against such a shortfall. And then lastly, there can be a claw-in. That would be where there's a partial, there's only a partial a portion of the shares acquired, so it's not a wholly owned subsidiary, and then the value is recalculated after a year, also based on warranties, and then a larger percentage of the shares can accrue to the acquirer. So let's say, for example, once again, the 100 million at a multiple of 6, that gives a value of 600 million. If 50% is acquired, that would mean 300 million is paid. Let's assume that the value was 80 million. That 80 million is multiplied by 6, gives you, or let's use an easy example. Let's say it is 50 million. So that 50 million times 6, that gives you 300 million value in total. So if the total value is 300 million, it means that they should own 100% of that business. So in other words, another 50% will then be clawed into the shareholding of that business. So the profit warranties, it can be a combination of those different methods. There can be other calculations or formulas that can be applied, and this is typically where a good transaction advisor or corporate advisor will negotiate an adequate formula to mitigate the risk for the acquirer. And then contractually, there can also be extensive warranties. Mostly these warranties relate to the business practices, corporate governance, possible contingent liabilities, etc. that there will have to be. But once again, it needs to be measured against the ability of the vendor or the seller to actually honour those warranties, if the acquirer would call upon those warranties. So how is value destroyed then? If you look at the pre-merger value, so in other words, that is the total value that was paid by the acquiring business, and you consider the costs, the transaction cost that we discussed, you look at the underperformance, possible contingent liabilities, negative synergies, you get to a post-merger value which can be substantially smaller than the pre-merger value, and that is the value that is destroyed, and that which is represented by the dotted bar on the right. If you paid a transaction premium over the intrinsic value, it means that there's even a bigger value destruction. But how is value created? Let's look again at the intrinsic value, and you look at those different costs and risks. You look at a transaction premium that you paid, so in other words, at the top of the black bar is your transaction price. But if you created those synergy benefits represented by the dotted bar on the right hand side, it means that it is more than the ultimate price paid. That is the post-merger value. It's larger than the pre-merger value, and that is the value that is created. So that's the value that is created by the synergy benefits. Let's look at the right fit. So when you look at synergy benefits, it's obviously very important to understand the how synergy benefits is a cornerstone of creating value for the business. So so what is the right fit then? Because obviously you need to pick the right synergy benefits. You need to design it. It's not something that falls into your lap or it just happens by default. It should be the result of careful planning and engineering the financial benefit that comes from those synergies. So how do you understand, or how do you go about to acquire companies that offer those type of synergy benefits? I think there are a few things that you need to consider. But mainly, this is the way that I look at it in the transactions that I do for my clients. I get a keen understanding of what the acquirer's competitive advantage is. Then we need to understand the company, what their competitive advantages are, and how it can complement the acquirer's competitive advantage. So in other words, if the acquirer, for example, is known as a very innovative company with a whole lot of new technology, and the target company has technology that can enhance the specific competitive advantage of the acquirer, that would be a good fit. But also you need to look at sensitive value drivers, and that is where the discounted cash flow method is so important. It's because it's when you break it down, you build it up from assumptions. So when you build it up from assumptions and you do your sensitivity analysis, you would get a good understanding of which one or which few of the assumptions has the greatest effect on the value of the business itself, on the enterprise value. Whether it would be consistent growth going forward, which is represented by growth into the future. It could be that the risk profile is substantially reduced in a larger company, which means that the low growth would lead to high valuation. It could be that the next 2 years can see a substantial increase in the revenue of the business, and then a sustainable growth from there. Or even just an increase in the margin, or the operating margin, or even the contribution margin of product. But you need to understand from your original models and your sensitivity analysis which one of those drivers are particularly sensitive. So if you look at the acquirer and you understand that the target has certain sensitive value drivers, how can that acquirer's competitive advantage unlock some of those value drivers in the target company? Let's say, for example, your gross profit margin is a very sensitive value driver for the target company. It may have a very high turnover, but it may be very thin on margins. The acquirer may have a competitive advantage that it has an excellent procurement department. So that competitive advantage can be applied to increase the margin of the target company, and therefore increase the value substantially post the merger. The same also with a target's competitive advantage. The reverse may be true. It may be that the target company has a particular technology, for example, that when used, or they have a particular specialized knowledge in some kind of a manufactured facility. And if the acquirer acquires that, and once again, it can open up a whole new market for them. It can drive their sales volume substantially forward if they can get those very unique products manufactured. That can unlock a lot of value for the acquiring company. So yes, typically you would look at technology companies. They would rather buy at a high price than to develop internally, because it's just much quicker and it unlocks their own competitive advantage. So let's look at an example of some combinations. Procurement we discussed with sales volumes. If the sales volumes are quite large of the one company, but the other company has excellent procurement policies and procurement structures in place, it means that the product or the components can be sourced at a much cheaper rate. It can be the rate at which, or the speed at which it's delivered can probably be much quicker. So that can give rise to a margin increase. Now, if the sales volumes are quite large, that has quite a large effect on the bottom line. It also has a large effect on the working capital of the business, because they don't need to carry stock for that long, and all the downstream costs associated to that. Distribution channels and unique brands. Some companies have widely established distribution channels, and they have brands, but if they add more unique brands to it, they can just channel those particular new brands or those unique brands through those distribution channels. They have the marketing muscle, they have the distribution muscle to get it into market much quicker. For example, if it's a small company with a niche brand, could ever have done that. So they can, so that extra sales in the target is unlocked. Very similar to that, if there's a big customer base on the one side and the product range on the other side, that can give rise to cross-selling. So typically what cross-selling means is that the one company can sell their products into the client base of the other company, let's say the acquirer and the target, and vice versa, if it is complementary to one another. So from both sides, from the acquirer's point of view, or from the acquirer's profitability perspective, as well as the target's profitability perspective, there's a gain post the merger. The one company may have a balance sheet that is quite substantial and it's quite strong, but not necessarily a growing profitability base. That could be in sectors that are not fast-growing sectors, but they're consistent performers that produce a lot of cash, and consistent cash, but not necessarily a growth in profits. That can be complemented by companies that are highly profitable, but they need an ongoing investment to keep on building that market. So it's a good fit. A larger investor or larger acquirer with deep pockets and a strong balance sheet combined with a company with exciting profit and growth prospects. An interesting one is management experience and innovation. What you find a lot of times with many startup companies, or there are a lot of with innovative products or new developments, it's at very early stages of its life cycle, and it needs to be that particular products or technology needs to be commercialized, and that is where the experienced management team can come in to guide those entrepreneurs to commercialize those products into the market. Market dominance and intellectual property. Certain companies have such a market dominance, and they can demand a much higher margin on intellectual property than what can be the case, if it's not a company with market dominance. It gives increase to margin, or high margin. Then a large product range. It can be a large product range on the one hand, and a geographical footprint. There can be unique products in South Africa, for example, or wherever the acquirer is situated or located. But if they want to expand into different markets, they can either establish their own operations there, or they can acquire other companies, and they can use that geographical footprint as a distribution channel to commercialize their products into new markets. Structure and growth goes hand in hand together with experience and innovation. Typically a company with existing management structures, management experience, etc., more established, combined with a company with high growth, where typically or a lot of times, especially if it's a younger company, you don't have that experience how to manage that growth. So the corporate governance structures, the experience of management, etc., gives the combined company the ability to realize that growth without it crashing down the line somewhere, because the growth can't be managed. And capacity and market demand. Many smaller companies have the demand to roll out products, but their growth is limited because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the distribution channels, they don't have the manufacturing capacity. Yes, they can increase it, but it takes time and it is slow. So if a company with excess capacity acquires a company where there's high demand for product and high growth, it can just accelerate that growth. So these are just a few examples of typical combinations that you'll look at, where a competitive advantage of the acquirer or the target can be combined with a sensitive value drivers or competitive advantage of the company being acquired, or the acquirer itself, the opposite in parties to the transaction. So which synergies should you pursue? It all depends on what works for the company. But typically, you need to take into account the time that it takes to realize and what the value of those synergies would be. So you would look at time and you would look at value. Obviously, there's quite a cost involved, and there's an integration period. But there is some low-hanging fruit that you can look at, and that is there's a chart that you can look at and consider typically what is going to take longer and what is going to be more sustainable. So there can be quick wins. Generally start with your game changers, which are your quick wins, but it's also sustainable. Your efficiency with the two combined, it's where typically you have quick wins. It's not necessarily sustainable, but it's on the table to take. And then where it's a byproduct could be tax losses and cash flow hedges, for example. A tax loss would be a company with an assessed tax loss. Just be careful how you manage it, by the way. or cash flow hedges, where there are different seasonal cycles, for example, and the companies are generally, the two companies are not in sync on their cash flow cycles. In other words, when the one company produces a lot of cash, the other one doesn't, and vice versa. It can mean that the overall dependence on an overdraft facility would fall if the one can cross-subsidize the other. So at what level of integration should you look at? You can get a shallow integration, which means that typically you would acquire the company, the shares itself. It may not be wholly owned, because you want to have a high level of autonomy and independence, and you want to incentivize the managers. When you look at that, you need to look at the synergies. Obviously, with a shallow integration, your synergies will be less than with a deeper integration. So with a deep integration, you look at wholly owned subsidiaries. Typically, it can also be divisionalized. There's not a high level of such a high level of autonomy and independence, but it's more integrated. And typically, there would be more synergies. But the consideration is shallow integration is quicker and is normally cleaner. So in other words, you can get your synergies quicker, but in the long run, you won't get so much synergy. Now, that can be, a shallow integration can be a particular growth model of companies that have a lot of cash, that can grow very quickly, they can do a lot of acquisitions. Now, if you have to integrate, it slows down your acquisition program. So in other words, you can't do as many acquisitions, which means that you can't get as much synergy from different acquisitions as what you wanted to. But if you're particularly good at deep integration, and to integrate the newly acquired companies into the business, you don't necessarily want to do so many acquisitions, then that can be a better strategy. So you just need to have a look at what works best for your business. So there are different levels also of integration that you need to take into account. Financially, your financial reporting, which is a minimum, your operations. Remember the PwC survey that not many operations are operationally successful. So you need to look at to what extent you want to integrate your operations, your HR, your human resources. With that comes different salary scales, it comes the culture between the different companies that you need to take into account to make the whole merger, the whole recipe works post-integration. And of course, you also need to look at brands, how you blend the one brand into the basket of brands of the acquiring company, whether you need to do that, do you need some independence on those brands. So the level of integration will be determined by a whole lot of those aspects and more. So different aspects also to consider: the cost and the complexity and the effort that goes into it, the time to implement the integration, the opportunity cost also that goes with that time to integrate, and what is the incentive to maximize profits. Remember, if there's a deep integration, it's very difficult to start to measure performance because it's integrated into the group as a whole. Whereas if it isn't as deeply integrated and it operates on an autonomous basis, then management, you can measure their performance by the profitability and the cash flows. So it's more incentive to keep on producing profits for the business. And obviously also tax efficiency, particularly with private equity fund type of transactions where transactions are backed by debt. You've got to look at the deductibility of the interest on the particular transaction. If shares are acquired, it's not always deductible, whereas a business is acquired, then it's generally it can be deducted. Obviously, that's the general rule, and each circumstance needs to be looked at separately. The different cultures and the management styles. I've heard some of my clients mention that it's so difficult to integrate, when it comes to culture, just to replicate the recipe of the holding company almost, because it's It is different because every business has a different culture. How long will it take to integrate those cultures? And sometimes there's a clash of cultures. It may work for the target company as a whole, but it doesn't work. The performance may be negatively impacted by a different culture in the business. For example, larger companies sometimes have a lot of structures. There's a lot of bureaucracy, whereas smaller companies sometimes are very entrepreneurial. So that's something to also consider. The synergies, as I mentioned, should be a driving force to determine the integration. Apply the 80-20 rule. In other words, look at the cost of integration versus the benefit that you're getting out of that. And also time. And what is the opportunity cost in applying those funds or those resources to acquire other companies? There is, however, a minimum level of integration that needs to take place. Obviously, you need to look at financial reporting, to report to the group shareholders, which is very important, corporate governance, ethics standards, integrity, and certain internal controls that you need to look at. And of course, you want to implement your group strategy. That would be one of the very reasons why you buy a company, is to fit into the group strategy, and you have to be able to implement that group strategy. Remember, applying the 80-20 rule, look at your game changers first, look at efficiency. So where the low-hanging fruit is, go for that first, and look at what falls into that, where you can get 80% of the synergy benefits by applying 20% of the time. And that will determine your level of integration. So what is your ideal approach when you acquire? Plan your strategy. Understand what you want to acquire, what will yield the maximum synergy benefits, and then you define your target, what the target should look like. Understand how you want to integrate. Is it going to be shallow? Is it going to be deep? Is there a project plan in place for that? What is it exactly that you require for such an integration to go smoothly? And only acquire when it fits into your profile. Don't acquire just for the sake of acquiring. Understand exactly what you are acquiring and why you're acquiring it. Align your due diligence with your strategic objectives. If you have a certain strategy that you want to execute, make sure in your due diligence that you look at the specific drivers that will make that will enable you to execute that strategy. If it's not evident, or if it's not present in the current business, the rationale for the transaction falls away. A transaction mechanism needs to be defined to reflect a fair price and also to manage the transaction risk. So you want to make sure that you don't pay for an underperforming asset and it only comes out later post the acquisition. The integration and the post-transaction measurement is critical, so that you understand, you get that feedback, and whether those synergy benefits are really realizing or if you're fooling yourself. And if it's not as effective as what you think or what you plan, don't worry. Doing acquisitions is like any core skill. You get better at it the more that you do it. Companies that do a lot of acquisitions get very good at it. And it's a real competitive advantage the more that you do it. When you look at your post-transaction measurement, you've got to look at financially, profitability, but you're also going to look at the soft issues. Operations, does it operate smoothly? Are there still certain glitches, anything that can be sorted out? The culture, how do the cultures blend? Do the people get along, etc.? Which, if they don't, it can affect the group's staff as a whole. And also look at the brands and the growth in the brands, and and obviously a financial measurement also around the sale of the different brands. If you exit, once again, understand how the buyer will think. So plan ahead. When is the right time to sell this business? So obviously you want to sell it at the peak of your profitability with some years of growth ahead of you. So if there is a warranty, that at least in the warranty period you can still achieve the profits that are forecasted. It's also a good time to sell, for example, to another company if the synergy benefits are there, or if the scale is there of a possible acquirer to take the business to the next level. But you need to look at when the right time would be for the business to maximize the value. And of course, also, with owner management businesses, the personal considerations, age, retirement, core focus that moves to other entrepreneurial concerns, for example, immigration. So all of that you need to take into account when you pick the right time. Don't wake up one day and say, well, I should start to consider this now. Let's look for a buyer. At least plan well ahead so that you know when the right time will be, and you can maximize your profits when the time comes. Understand your strengths, because you remember your competitive advantage may be a drawing card for the acquirer, and understand how that translates into value. So know your acquirer and who the ideal fit would be. Understand what the typical synergy benefits would be that would be realized, and then you can pick typically your approaches when you approach the companies or potential acquirers. It's a good idea to start to build a relationship and to start to have a dialogue with those potential acquirers well in advance, so that you don't negotiate from a position of desperation. A transaction advisor is critical and well worth the fees. Typically, transaction advisors would charge a percentage on a success base. That percentage is normally negotiable, but the value that is added throughout the process in terms of additional value that the seller would get out of the transaction, or even tax efficiency that you get with it, the negotiation experience, etc., is well worth the fees. Remember that transaction advisors do it for a living, whereas companies that sell, or the owners that sell, typically only do it once or twice in their lifetime. If it's a company that sells off underlying businesses, there may be a better understanding of that sales process, but it's not necessarily a core strength of the business itself. And also, it takes time for management, and there's a lot of emotional time that is invested in such a process. How do you engineer the synergy benefits throughout the process? And this is typically where your transaction advisor can help you. Typically in the phase where you look at your acquisition framework and your profile, your criteria, you can define the specific profile of the companies that are being acquired. And you can your advisor can typically look at your acquisitions when they start to source it and pick the right fit for your business. When you have a discussion around the target company management, you understand which topics to touch on. You understand what the sensitive negotiation issues are, and you can center your conversation around those particular topics. Certainly, when you do the price determination and the valuation, the graph that I discussed with you, understanding the negotiation range, the intrinsic value, etc., and how the synergies would play a role in that. What would be the value post the acquisition? Understand that well as part of the negotiation process. Obviously, also when your term sheet is defined, or where a heads of agreement is drawn up, or the framework of the agreement is determined, make sure that those synergy benefits can realize. Make sure that there are adequate risk mechanisms in place for those synergy benefits, and that you can make sure that you realize the synergy benefits. As part of the due diligence process, design your due diligence scope to look at those specific issues as part of the synergy benefits that you want to realize, that strategic fit that you want. And obviously also carry that over to your legal agreements and your transaction structuring. Lastly, when you do your post-merger integration, design your process to the extent that you can measure your synergy benefits and the value that is added through the transaction. Thank you very much. That concludes the webinar on mergers and acquisitions. Just a short summary of typically what Pollination Capital does. Pollination Capital, I'm the founder of Pollination Capital, and a lot of my knowledge comes not only through research, but I guess most of it comes from experience. So what is it that we do? We do acquisitions for corporate clients mostly, and selling businesses and capital raising. We play typically in the middle market, so the minimum transaction that we'll look at would be 20 million, and typically the maximum of what we've done is about 250 million rand transactions. We like to work with CFOs. Pollination Capital actually is originated from a consulting firm, a corporate finance consulting firm called Intellifin, and we built a lot of networks with chief financial officers, and hence we work very well with them on buy-side mandates. Why is there value for them in using us? Well, typically we're a third party, and we bring a specialist perspective. It takes a lot of the emotion out of a transaction for them. But we facilitate in conjunction with the CFO, so we keep the CFO or even the CEO as involved as they want to be. But they need to feel that we are a duplication and better than the skills that he can bring to the table when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. Obviously, executives are very busy people, and an acquisition or a merger is in addition to the normal duties. So they may have capacity constraints, and they look at typically us as transaction advisors to help them to perform a good quality process, or to manage a good quality process where they don't necessarily have the time to do that. And of course, we are success fee based, so in other words, if the transaction doesn't work out, we don't get paid. I just want to mention a cloud business that we're working on, that we're launching soon, called Worth.business. It's a cloud-based business valuation tool that allows you to value a business online, and we'll be releasing that pretty soon. And so if you want to get in touch with us, please, you can email me directly. You can also have a look at our website, have a look at our Twitter page. You can contact me directly, especially also with Worth.business. If that is something that would interest you, please feel free to get in touch with me, and we'll let you know when it launches. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, now's the time.